Τώρα είχε έρθει μια κυρία εδώ και μου έλεγε ότι πάσχει από κατάθλιψη. Η κατάθλιψη είναι ένα αίσθημα δυσάρεστο το οποίο σε καταλαμβάνει και σε καθυλώνει. Ούτε να σκεφτείς ούτε σκέπτεσαι.
She came to him and said she suffers from depression, not anxious, not stressed, not going through a hard season, depressed. And she said it the way people say it when they've been saying it for a long time, when the word has stopped feeling dramatic and started feeling like just the truth, like a fact about themselves they've accepted. She had a piano at home. She used to play it. She doesn't anymore. She stopped taking care of her home. She stopped wanting things. She was living on pills. She had abandoned her music, forgotten it almost entirely, and replaced her days with the kind of stillness that has nothing peaceful about it. Most people would look at that and see someone who needs more support, better medication, adjusted dosage, more therapy, something clinical, something measurable. He looked at her and started talking about music, not as small talk, not as a warm-up to the real conversation. He told her many things about music, about what it does to a person, about why it matters. And then he said something that doesn't fit neatly into any diagnosis. The main reason for depression, and for lethargy, laziness, apathy, and all the psychological things that torture us, is that there is such a big ego in you. Not a chemical imbalance, not a trauma response, not a broken pattern of thinking that needs restructuring. A big ego. And before you dismiss that as harsh or reductive, stay with it for a second. Because he wasn't using ego the way self-help culture uses it. He wasn't talking about arrogance. He wasn't talking about pride in the way we usually mean it. He was pointing at something more specific, something more uncomfortable. He was talking about the soul that has turned entirely toward itself, that has made itself the center, the subject, the object, the beginning, and the end of every thought. And here's the thing about a soul that does that. It doesn't feel like self-absorption from the inside. It feels like suffering. You think you're having serious thoughts. You think you're processing something real, something deep. But what you're actually doing is circling. The same idea, the same wound, the same fear, around and around. That crushing feeling he described, the one that presses you from the inside out, that makes it impossible to think clearly. That's not emptiness. Emptiness would almost be a relief. What depression actually feels like, the kind he was pointing at, is more like fullness, a terrible, suffocating fullness, full of yourself, full of your own pain, your own thoughts, your own voice, your own narrative about your own life. The prison isn't that there's nothing inside. The prison is that there's only one thing inside. And it's you. When she described her depression, she described it entirely in terms of what she had stopped doing, stopped playing, stopped caring, stopped wanting. But notice what she hadn't stopped. She hadn't stopped thinking. She hadn't stopped feeling. She hadn't stopped being intensely, painfully aware. She was still very much alive inside, just pointed entirely inward, with nowhere for that aliveness to go. And so it became what it became. That power of the soul, genuine capacity for feeling, for depth, for intensity, had no outward direction. And what can't flow outward starts to corrode whatever contains it. He said it plainly. What previously captured the soul was a power of the soul. And instead of making something good out of it, it turned into torturing depression. That capacity for feeling deeply, for caring intensely, that isn't the illness. That's actually the gift. The illness is what happens to the gift when it has no object outside itself. When all that intensity folds back inward, when the soul is sensitive enough to feel everything but has nothing to reach toward, the very thing that could have made someone extraordinary becomes the thing that destroys them quietly from the inside. So what did he prescribe? not a new technique for managing symptoms, not a reframe, not a breathing exercise. He told her to start playing piano again, little by little. That's it. And to most modern ears, that sounds either quaint or irresponsible. She was barely functioning. She was on medication. She hadn't touched the instrument in years, and his answer was, "Go home and play." But understand what he was actually saying. He wasn't saying music is therapy. He wasn't saying art heals trauma. He wasn't making a clinical recommendation at all. He was saying, your soul needs something outside itself to move toward. And music, real music, music you have to be present for, music that demands your attention and pulls it outward, is one of the few things that can do that without forcing it. You can't play piano while fully living inside your own head. The music won't let you. It requires you to listen, to respond, to be somewhere outside yourself, even for a few minutes, even just that. And alongside the music, he told her to pray and to try to know and love Christ. He said the love of God is the greatest thing that captures the soul, not the most comforting, not the most inspiring. The greatest thing that captures. That word matters. Because what he was describing isn't discipline, it isn't effort, it isn't self-improvement through spiritual practice. It's the soul finding something so much larger than itself that it finally stops circling its own.
Νομίζει ότι εσύ σκέφτεσαι σοβαρά πράγματα, ενώ εσύ είσαι εχμάλωτος μιας ιδέας. Της λέω, ξέρεις μουσικά? Δεν ήξερα πιάνω, λέω, αλλά τα έχω εγκαταλείψει όλα, ένεκα της καταθλίψεως. Ζω όλο με τα φάρμακα. Δεν θέλω, λέει, ούτε το σπίτι κοιτάζω καλά, ούτε μουσικά που ήξερα τα παράτησα, τα έχω ξεχάσει, μου λέει. Λοιπόν, της είπα πολλά πράγματα για τα μουσικά και περισσότερο της είπα απ' όλα είναι η αγάπη προς το Θεό. Είναι το μεγαλύτερο πράγμα που εχμαλωτίζει την ψυχή, διότι δεν είναι απλώς μια ενέργεια της ψυχής προς το Θεό, αλλά είναι το σπουδαίο ότι είναι η χάρη του Θεού που γεμίζει έπειτα την ψυχή και την κάνει άλλο. Δηλαδή αυτό το οποίο την είχε καταλάβει ήταν μια ψυχική δύναμη και αντί να γίνει κάτι καλό, ο διάβολος την δύναμη αυτή την ψυχική την έκανε κατάθλιψη και βασάνιζε τον άνθρωπο.
Wounds because it has something else to orbit. That's what grace does, he said. It fills the soul and transforms it. It's not only an act of the soul toward God, it's God filling the soul from outside, which is the opposite of what depression does. Depression is entirely self-generated, self-sustained, self-referential. The soul feeding on its own emptiness and calling it thought. Grace moves in the other direction. Something comes in from outside. Something that doesn't ask you to examine yourself more carefully. It asks you to look somewhere else entirely. And this is where it gets strange. Because everything we do for depression today points inward. Therapy. Examine your past, your patterns, your inner world. Journaling. Write down your thoughts, your feelings, your story. Mindfulness. Observe your internal experience, moment to moment. All of it inward. All of it asking the soul to look more carefully at itself. And for some people that helps. For some wounds, that's exactly right. But what about the person for whom more self-examination is just more rope? What about the soul that is already so consumed by itself, so trapped inside its own experience that asking it to look inward more carefully is like asking someone drowning to study the water? He was describing a different problem. Not a soul that needs to understand itself better. A soul that needs to get outside itself, not through willpower, not through discipline or effort or the right mindset, through something that genuinely captures it. Music, prayer, love, something real and larger than the self. Because you can't force your way out of ego. Trying harder to be less self-focused is still self-focused. The only thing that actually works is when something outside you becomes more interesting than you are. When beauty pulls you. When music demands your presence. When love, real love, not the feeling of being loved, but the act of loving something outside yourself, gives the soul somewhere to go. That woman came to him crushed. She had stopped playing, stopped caring, stopped wanting, living inside a prison she couldn't name and medicating the symptoms of it without ever touching the cause. And he didn't dismiss the pills. He didn't tell her to stop. He didn't pretend she wasn't suffering. He told her, above everything else is the love of God. It is the greatest thing that captures that soul. And then he said, go home and play piano. Those two things weren't separate prescriptions. They were the same prescription. Get the soul moving outward, toward beauty, toward something it didn't manufacture, toward something that exists completely independent of your pain. That's either the most naive thing you've heard, or it's the most honest answer anyone has ever given to the question of why. For some people, nothing else has worked, because maybe the problem was never what they thought it was. Maybe it was never about chemicals or childhood or cognitive distortions. Maybe it was simpler and harder than all of that. A soul that stopped having anywhere to go. And when a soul has nowhere to go, it doesn't go quiet. It gets louder. It amplifies everything. Every small failure becomes evidence of something permanent. Every hard day becomes proof of something terminal. Every silence becomes unbearable because the only voice filling it is your own. That's the trap. And the trap is invisible from inside it, because it feels exactly like being self-aware. It feels like knowing yourself deeply. It feels like being honest about your pain. But there's a difference between a soul that looks at itself clearly and a soul that can't look anywhere else. One leads somewhere, the other just circles. He saw that difference. After decades of sitting with people no one else knew how to help, after listening to the specific texture of how people describe their suffering, he saw that beneath the depression, beneath the apathy, beneath the pills and the abandoned hobbies and the not wanting anything, there was still a soul, fully alive, fully capable, just aimed at nothing. And his answer wasn't to fix the soul, it was to give it somewhere to go. A piano sitting in the corner of a room, waiting,